So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of what we did before Trovata. So like most companies, we relied on an Excel-based forecast. So initially when I first started, we were manually downloading a bank statement, and I was actually keying in the actual data every single day for, looking through the statement. Was this payroll? Was this AR? Was this AP, etc. Over time, we did get a little bit more advanced. So we started using Power Query to automatically tag some of the transactions, similar to what Trovata does. This would still require us to manually download a bank statement every day, but we were able to use some of, the more advanced Excel tools to categorize some of the data. But there were some major limitations to that. So some of the major limitations, the first one was we were really only looking at the header account of our cash concentration structure. So we weren't looking at any of the individual sub ZBA accounts. So we were having to tag things in really large buckets, like looking if it came out of this account, it was AP. If it came in from this account, it was AR. We had very little visibility into our individual transactional level detail. Additionally, we were only looking at our domestic accounts. The way our bank reports data for our domestic accounts versus our international accounts is slightly different. So it would have taken quite a bit of work to kind of marry those two data sets. And then additionally, the file size would have become a problem. Even just looking at our domestic US header account of our ZBA, every day we were adding hundreds of transactions to this file. It got to the point where it would take 10 to 20 minutes just to open the file. And by the end, I was really the only one looking at it. I don't think many, or if any of our senior leadership was ever actually opening the file. So it really just wasn't a scalable solution, which is why we went out and looked for a software provider and ended up with Trovata. After implementing Trovata, we were able to recreate some of those transaction tags that we had in Excel but with a lot more power and flexibility. So Trovata allows you to create tags looking at the BAI code of the transaction, the remittance detail, debit or credit indicators, transaction amounts, really any information that the bank has gets fed over into Trovata, and you can slice and dice your transactions based on that data, which gave us a far greater level of granularity than we had before. And additionally, it gave us access to all of our transactions. So not just the header ZBA account, but all the individual accounts underneath it. And then also it gave us access to all of our international banking data. So this led to some pretty big improvements. Like I said, we stopped categorizing transactions on these very large buckets. We were able to slice and dice the data, making it much more accurate and actionable for our forecasting. Additionally, we use their variance analysis tool. Doing variance analysis used to take me multiple hours every single month. Now it's calculated instantaneously when the data is fed over from the bank. We can look at it at any time period, and we have the ability to, quickly dig into those actuals. So we don't have to dig through massive Excel files or bank statements to see what's causing those variances. So overall, from implementing Trovata, we went from a pretty slow manual and error-prone process to a pretty fast, detailed, and scalable process that also allows us to forecast all of our international cash as well as our domestic cash. So it really has been a big step up for our business and team. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the process we went through to actually set up the forecasts. So when we first got access to Trovata, the first thing we needed to do was categorize all of our inflows and outflows using that Trovata tagging engine that we've talked about before. So we built off what we previously had in Excel, but like I said, with a lot more granularity, looking at individual customer level transactions, vendor payments, payroll payments, benefits, etc. So we created tags for all of our major transaction categories. And then we created what's called a data stream. So think of a data stream as like an individual line item on your forecast. So for example, your benefits data stream would be a combination of tags for your different benefit providers. So think your HSA funding, your healthcare payments, your dental payments, etc. And then you can see an example of what a data stream looks like there on the screen. And essentially what the data stream is used for is to look at that historical data and then forecast out in the future. So Trovata has a number of different forecast methodologies that can be used, but the one we found most useful and use the most at Eversana is the repeat history function. So essentially what that will do is it will look at a historical period of data and use that actual bank data to forecast out in the future. So if you think payroll, for example, if we want to look at the last 3 months of payroll, we can then use that to forecast out the next 3 months. And you can do, whatever time frame you want. And as we all know, previous data isn't always a great indicator of what's going to happen in the future. So Truvata very easily allows you to add growth and diminishing factors to this. So for example, if you're looking at payroll and you expect your headcount to grow over the next 3 months, you can say to Truvata, hey, look at the last 3 months, forecast this out into the next 3 months, but assume payroll is going to grow, 5% over those 3 months. Additionally, another feature that I think is really helpful is you have the ability to manually input any data into the forecast you want. So this is great for one-off items like a bonus payment, for example, that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in the historical data, or cash flows that aren't historically consistent. So we do have a number of cash flows in our business that looking at the historical data doesn't really do a great job of forecasting out in the future. So we can rely on, some of our FP&A forecasts to manually input that data. And that data can be input by just manually keying it in if it's like a one-off M&A item, or if there are more transactions that you need to enter in, you can easily copy and paste them from an Excel or other area where you have that data living. So then once we had all of the data streams created, we can create the overall forecast. So what we did for the US is we created data streams for all of our major transaction types and entities. So think like AR for entity one, AR for entity two, etc. And then we combined those all into one forecast. So it's looking at all of our different transactional level details at each one of those data streams. We then repeated this process for all of our international entities, creating one forecast per entity. And then the other thing that's really nice about Trovata is it allows you to create what kind of like a forecast of forecasts. So you can group together different forecasts so you can see different cash positions. So one of the things we've done is we have multiple entities within the EU. So we have an individual forecast for each one of those entities, but then we can group them together to look at an overall EU cash forecast so we can see our true European cash position. And you can slice and dice that however you want. So you can look at whatever region of data is applicable for your business. Lastly, I quickly want to touch on our implementation timeline. So when we first got access to Trovata, it took us probably about 2 months to set up all of the transaction tags, data streams, and forecasts. And then once we had those set up, we spent another 2 months running our Excel-based forecast alongside the Trovata forecast, just to ensure the accuracy of the Trovata forecast. But it became pretty evident pretty fast that the Trovata forecast was much more accurate than our previous Excel. So after about 4 months from initially getting access to Trovata, we were able to retire the cash forecast, and I thankfully haven't opened it since. Nick, if you want to move on to the next slide. Yeah, okay. So now that we've discussed building the forecast, I want to talk about how we can use this data and actually make it actionable. So as I've mentioned before, and I think Chris mentioned it as well, one of the most useful features in Trovata is the forecast versus actual analysis. So as I mentioned, this used to take me hours to calculate, and I really only ever looked at it monthly because it took hours to calculate it. Whereas now in Trovata, I can look at it for any time period I want, and it's calculated automatically. So you can see on the screen is kind of an example of what it looks like. If you look at Entity 1 AP, that top line there is the forecasted data. The second line is what your actual data was for the month. Third line is dollar variance, and then the fourth line there is the percent variance. So I still look at this historically on a monthly basis. So on the first day of every month, I can go into Trovata and automatically see how did our forecast compare to our actual data for the prior month. And with any large variances, all I have to do is click into that actual line, so that second line there on the entity AP1, and it'll automatically pull up a full listing of all of the different transactions that occurred in that period. So I can easily and quickly tell whether or not it was just a timing issue of like an AR payment that was supposed to come in, towards the end of the month, didn't come in, probably going to come in early this month, or if there was some kind of assumption error that was made in the overall forecast that I need to correct going forward. So this allows us to basically assess how our forecast performed and decide if we need to make any adjustments going forward. For any timing issues, we probably don't need to make adjustments, but for any assumption issues, we can fix those going forward in the forecast. So we usually kind of roll it monthly. And then we also check with our, FP&A team to see if there's any big budget items that we need to include in the forecast as well. So since implementing Trovata and being able to quickly look at all of this real-time data, we've been able to get our forecast variance down to a single-digit percentage for our cash flow, which is significantly better than what we had when we were using our historical Excel-based forecast. Additionally, we use Trovata for some of the reporting. So we send out a daily cash update to senior leadership that basically just looks at, current day cash activity, prior day, month to date, and then also how we're trending towards the forecast. So we no longer have to do any of that manually. All of that is automatically calculated for us within Trovata. So overall, since implementing Trovata, we've seen far better accuracy in our cash forecast. We've gained visibility into all of our accounts globally that we didn't have before, and we've significantly reduced the time we spend manually reporting data to our senior leadership.